and a successful campaign to raise the minimum wage in New York to $15 per hour.
We're going to lead the way. The nation's going to watch us, and we're going to raise up this state.
But here's what really happened. Instead of helping New York's low-wage workers, the movement is destroying their jobs. It's pushed some car washes to replace their employees with machines and others to close down. Increasingly, workers have no choice but to ply their trade out of illegal vans parked on the street because the minimum wage has made it illegal for anyone to hire them at the going rate. At the same time, businesses that have chosen to automate are benefiting.
Thank you so much for $15 an hour, the best thing that could happen to us.
Because outlawing cheap labor makes it harder for new competitors to undercut them on price and service.
It seems like a great irony that the policies that are meant to help the poor are the same policies that are taking away their jobs. But in fact, this is not a bug in the policy. It's a feature. Economic historian Thomas C. Leonard has devoted extensive research to the economists and the economic ideas of the progressive era in American politics, which started in the late 19th century and achieved its zenith during the administration of Woodrow Wilson. In Leonard's research, he documents how the first advocates of the minimum wage did not do so because they believed that a wage floor would help the poor to earn more money. They advocated for a minimum wage because it helps to disemploy the so-called unemployables, and, it was hoped, eliminate them from the gene pool.
The unemployable is a kind of buzz phrase that I think was probably coined by Sidney and Beatrice Webb, who were Fabian socialists, founders of the London School of Economics, and whose work was widely read by American progressives. And with whom American progressives had a very kind of fruitful transatlantic interaction with. The idea it's a misnomer, of course, because the unemployable refers to people many of whom were actually employed, and the idea here is that a certain category of worker is willing to work for wages below what progressives regarded as a living wage or a fair wage, and that these sorts of people, who were often called feeble-minded when they were mentally disabled, or defectives when they were physically disabled, were doing this sort of transgressing in multiple ways. The first thing was, by accepting lower wages, they were undermining the deserving American working man, where American really means Anglo-Saxon. The second thing is, because they were willing to accept low wages, the American worker was unwilling to do so, to accept these low wages, and so instead opted to have smaller families. That argument went by the name of race suicide. The solution, by the way, to race suicide, a very potent solution, which was first proposed by Richard T. Ely, was a minimum wage. A minimum wage. And the idea, if you had a minimum wage, you would sort the undesirables who would lose their job if they were already working, or would be deterred from coming to the United States in the first place. So if you have a minimum wage, you assure that only the most productive workers, who are assumed to be Anglo-Saxon white Protestant men, will keep their jobs and get a raise, and all the inferiors of various types will either lose their job or will be deterred from coming in the first place. Only the most productive, deserving workers keep their jobs and thus can afford to support larger families, thereby averting a race to the racial bottom.
In his work, Leonard demonstrates how this propensity for minimum wage laws to keep the poor, the feeble-minded, the shiftless, and other unemployables out of the workforce was not some fringe idea or unwanted side effect of these policies, but the main economic argument for putting these laws into place. The idea, according to its leading proponents, was to make sure that the undesirable workers would not be able to get work by undercutting the wages of more respectable laborers, and thus they would not be able to support families. By this process, the family trees of those deemed unworthy of the minimum wage would dwindle, and the families of better stock who could earn their keep at a higher wage would flourish. As alien as this thinking is to most of us today, it is part of a guiding philosophy of the progressive era: eugenics. As we learned in Why Big Oil Conquered the World, eugenics was the belief that the rich and powerful were, by virtue of their genes, fit to rule over the inferior classes, and that the poor suffered not from chance, fate, ingrained social hierarchy, or other forms of injustice, but from poor genes.
Eugenics is basically a movement among the elite to eradicate what they deem the inferior classes, and that's the inferior social classes, racial classes, ethnic classes, more or less everyone who isn't up to their standards. And after eradicating those classes, what they aim to do is genetically engineer themselves to such a high level that the remaining population that they permit to exist beneath them will never have the power to overthrow them, essentially, the end of history. So the term itself was coined by Galton, and it essentially means well-born. The idea is kind of a mix of a bunch of ideas that were circulating around the 1850s. So if you go back to, say, Mendel was studying hereditary characteristics in pea plants, and he was able to determine that certain characteristics were being passed on and that these things could be determined and essentially predicted.
When eugenics was brought to the shores of turn-of-the-century America by Charles Davenport, it quickly received the support of the wealthy monopolists of the day, the Rockefellers and Carnegies chief among them. But more importantly, it appealed to the progressive academicians who were pioneering new fields of social science. These technocrats, convinced of the righteousness of their cause in spreading the social gospel, found purpose in the eugenic injunction to promote the reproduction of the fit and to weed out the feeble-minded from the gene pool. The early progressive economists made no attempt to hide their eugenic motivations in promoting minimum wage laws. Take Henry Rogers Segers, a Columbia economist and president of the American Association for Labor Legislation, who wrote in a key paper on the minimum wage law published in the Annals of the American Academy in 1913, "If we are to maintain a race that is to be made up of capable, efficient, and independent individuals and family groups, we must courageously cut off lines of heredity that have been proved to be undesirable by isolation or sterilization of the congenitally defective. Michigan has just passed an act requiring the sterilization of congenital idiots. This may seem somewhat remote from the minimum wage, but such a policy judiciously extended should make easier the task of each oncoming generation which insists that every individual who is regularly employed in the competitive labor market shall receive at least a living wage for his work." In 1910, Royal Meeker, a Princeton economist who served as Woodrow Wilson's U.S. Commissioner of Labor, opined that it is much better to enact a minimum wage law, even if it deprives these unfortunates of work. Better that the state should support the inefficient wholly and prevent the multiplication of the breed, than subsidize incompetence and unthrift, enabling them to bring forth more of their kind. Arthur Holcomb, a professor of government at Harvard and a member of the Massachusetts Minimum Wage Commission, wrote approvingly of how Australia's own minimum wage laws protect the white Australians' standard of living from the invidious competition of the colored races, particularly of the Chinese. This is the real history of the minimum wage in America. By their own admission, a belief in the eugenic effect of eradicating the lower classes from the gene pool is the reason that its early progressive proponents advocated for minimum wage laws at all. Of course, no one is suggesting that the people marching under the Fight for 15 banner are eugenicists, or that they are trying to exterminate the defective germplasm of the unemployables. That is patently not the case. Modern-day progressives instead turn to newer economic models and theories to defend their living wage movement. A highly cited 1990